So when I set up this class for my students, one of the things that I promised you is that we're only talking about history in ways that make sense today and still have sort of some conversation about relevant things today. So that's what we're going to do today. Today's video is really about the things that we decided in 1867 at that Charlottetown conference that are still super, super important today in our current environment. So the first of them is an economic piece. So one of the promises that was made in order to convince a couple of colonies, specifically British Columbia and Prince Edward Island, to join up with this sort of Canadian experiment, is the encouragement of east-west trade. So if you look at Canada geographically, and you sort of look at the easiest possible trade routes, almost all of them run north-south. Because that's where the rivers run. And in the 1840s, the easiest way to move goods is to move them along the rivers. And that would mean that the easiest trading partner for someone living in the Canadian West is to trade south with the United States. And so this sort of desire to create east-west trading relationships meant that essentially those manufacturers working in Ontario would have markets for their goods and would be able to access and purchase the grain and the sort of raw resources, the timber, that sort of thing, produced on the Canadian prairies. So in order to do that, you have massive government investments as a result of these sort of 1867 agreements in the development of railways and telegraph lines. Essentially, in order to convince British Columbia to join Confederation, they had to promise to build a railway to BC. In order to convince Prince Edward Island to join Confederation, they had to promise to build a bridge to the island, even though, and that worked somehow, even though the technology to build that bridge didn't exist until the 1990s. So if you've ever driven out that way and you sort of wonder, like, why on earth did we build a bridge to Prince Edward Island? Victoria does just fine with ferries and airplanes. The answer is that that bridge, the Confederation Bridge, was a promise that was made in 1867 and to convince Prince Edward Island to join up to the Canadian experiment in 1873. Like, that's part of this conversation. So that construction of rail and telegraph lines is really, really important. We will get to sort of some other consequences of those rail and telegraph lines, but what that was essentially designed to do is ease friction on trading between provinces rather than trading with the United States. So that's part of it. And another sort of part of that process is the elimination of provincial trade barriers. And this is probably more contemporarily relevant to most Albertans than it is in other parts of the country. But this is essentially the legal situation that says it's not allowed for Alberta to decide to charge tariffs and sort of to charge extra taxes on wine, say, coming from BC. So there's sort of no provincial trade barriers. And so we have that sort of as a standard context to sort of that comes from our legacy of 1867. We have some other sort of structural questions. So if you've ever wondered, like, why on earth does Canada have a Senate? It doesn't appear to do anything at all. The answer is Confederation in 1867. So in order to convince the political elite to sort of sign up to this process, one of the things that was promised in Confederation was essentially that there would be a government house, in this case the Senate, that was essentially there to represent the interests of the elite. And we can sort of talk a lot about what that looks like. And that in particular, the Senate House would have the power to refuse legislation created by the elected bodies. We could dig into what that looks like and whether or not that's been used. It's not a very contemporary thing, although technically it exists, right? Like, technically the Senate can look at the House of Commons and go like, yeah, no, you can't have that law, take it back. It's challenging to do that in a contemporary context because of the sort of unelected nature of the Senate, but that's sort of part of it. The composition of the Senate, which we will also talk about a little bit later in terms of who has how many seats, is also decided in 1867, and it very much reflects the political realities that were in place in 1867, and there isn't really a great way of changing it. So in the House of Commons, right, we can move around the number of sort of MPs based on population. So if you get a ton of people who move to BC, you can add members of parliament to sort of the British Columbia contingent. You can create new ridings in BC and Vancouver, Victoria, and all of that sort of stuff, and in that sort of way kind of equalize the political power. You can't do that in the Senate. And we'll sort of talk about that a little bit when we talk about the Constitution and why that's important. But that's fixed in 1867. And then the other thing that is really, really important to fix, to understand, was sort of like set out in 1867, and to understand why that's important, is the conversation about what level of government has what powers and has what responsibilities. Okay? This is a conversation you have to settle if you're going to create a new country, especially a new country like Canada that has two levels of government. Actually three, but municipal governments are sort of created by provincial governments. So in Canada, we have a federal government that governs the entire country, and then we have provincial governments that govern regions within that country, and then the provincial governments create municipal governments. We're not going to talk a ton about municipal governments in this class, not because they're not important, but because they're a little bit more complex and they don't sort of hit that macro scale. But for right now, it's really important to understand that when you set up a government with both a provincial government and a federal government, you kind of need to make some decisions about who's going to do what. Okay? And that's sort of this question about division of powers. So in 1867, there's a couple of decisions that we make. So the first one of these is to say that negotiation of international treaties and management of Canada's military and sort of armed forces is a federal responsibility. Okay, federal responsibility, awesome. Fisheries are understood as a federal responsibility as well, because they sort of cross provincial boundaries, right? Like Nova Scotia and New Brunswick can't manage their fisheries separately because the fish don't recognize borders. So you need sort of a larger sort of conversation to deal with that. And then we have some powers that are granted to the provinces. Okay, so the provinces are given power over healthcare and education, and the logic for that is that the provinces are closer, and so we're better able to regulate what the population that's living there needs, right? Because the understanding is that in the 1860s, it's really hard for a bureaucrat in Ottawa to know specifically what people living in Edmonton, in Grand Prairie, are actually going to need from their healthcare and their education system. Okay? It's important to understand in that division of powers that in 1867, the government's role in providing healthcare and education is almost entirely regulatory. As much as those are the two largest expenses of every provincial government across the country today, in 1867, the responsibility of the provincial government was not to provide hospitals, pay doctors, negotiate with nurses, ensure that people get vaccinations. That was not the job of the provincial government in 1867 in healthcare. In 1867, the provincial government's responsibility in terms of healthcare was essentially to regulate who was allowed to call themselves a doctor and what they were allowed to do. So, for example, no, you can't just call yourself a doctor because you want to be a doctor. You have to have these qualifications. And no, doctors are not allowed to perform experimental surgeries. Like, here's the list of things that you can diagnose. Like, all of those sort of practical questions. And they're doing the same thing for education. And that's because in 1867, almost all of those sort of institutions that were providing healthcare and education were provided either privately in some larger communities or were run by churches. Okay, so you're talking about religious hospitals, religious schools, private hospitals, and private schools. So the government is sort of performing those regulatory bodies. The exception to those sort of provincial responsibilities around healthcare and education come when we talk about Indigenous people. And we will talk about this a little bit later on, but because treaties are a federal responsibility, and because Indigenous populations in Canada are negotiated by treaty, the only Canadian citizens whose education and healthcare is the responsibility of the federal government and not the provincial government is Indigenous Canadians living on reserve. This creates a lot of tensions that we're still sort of dealing with today. We'll talk about them a whole bunch when we talk about Indigenous history and Indigenous life. But for now, sort of understand there's that kind of piece. Okay? That's the simple part of this question. The next part of this question is where a lot of the really weird tensions sort of get into in our understanding of what's happening in Canada today. Because none of you have probably ever created a country with multiple levels of government, but when you do so, you need to make decisions. because you need to think about the possibility that there are going to be areas where the government needs to make decisions and needs to be able to act that people in 1867 didn't think about. Okay, so some really, really great examples for what that might look like in a contemporary context for Canada is in 1867, nobody has understood that airplanes are a thing. So there's no need for, like, no one is going to sit down and talk about, hey, how do we regulate air travel? Because air travel doesn't exist in 1867. There's no one who's sitting down in 1867 and talk about, hey, how do we deal with climate change? How do we deal with pollution? How do we deal with environmental regulation? Because those are things that don't exist as sort of a necessity for government to perform in 1867. Okay? So what you have to do in order to set up a country is to talk about what political scientists call residual powers. And residual powers are like, so when stuff comes up and we don't know what it's going to be yet, who's responsible for that thing? Okay? So to what level of government do the residual powers, the like things government's going to need to intervene on, but we're not sure what it is just yet. In Canada, residual powers go to the federal government. So if it is not specifically listed as a provincial responsibility in the constitutional in the Confederation Agreements of 1867, it's a federal government responsibility in Canada. For reference, the United States made the opposite decision. So in the United States, powers that are not specifically granted to the federal government in the sort of documents that create the United States as a country default to the states. And one of the things that means is that in Canada, the regulation of something like the internet, which also doesn't exist in 1867, is a federal responsibility. But in the United States, it's a state responsibility. So there's some tensions around that. This is a really, really, really complicated question because we wind up with, in today's society, a number of things that have changed dramatically since 1867, or we've come up with some stuff that doesn't really fit the model that we had when we divided these powers in 1867. So the justification, for example, for the federal government today intervening on climate change is that climate winds up being a residual power. It's something that the government needs to do something about, and it is not specifically granted to the provinces. So far, so good. However, how do you deal with the intersection between climate change legislation, which the federal government is arguing is a federal responsibility, and natural resources legislation, which is officially granted as a provincial government responsibility, right? There's these really odd tensions that kind of get created because of that. There's also been some significant changes in what government does since the 1860s, right? In 1867, the government was not responsible for paying for healthcare or education at all, except in a contemporary context. That's exactly what the government is doing. If you look at like more than half of the budget of every provincial government in the country is paying for healthcare and paying for education. That's a massive expenditure, and we could sort of dig into the Canada Healthcare Act in this sort of context, but there's a lot of weird spaces, and it remains a constitutional issue, right? Because there is such thing as, for example, the Canada Health Act that creates these sort of standards of sort of this is the baseline standard of healthcare that all Canadians should be able to get across the board, and it's enacted by the federal government. But the federal government doesn't have responsibility for healthcare, so they have to do some really, really weird things. So if you sort of have heard or seen the news about sort of provincial governments and the federal government sitting down to sort of talk about new healthcare agreements and that kind of stuff, the basic way that works is that the federal government convinces the provinces to adhere to the standards set out in the Federal Healthcare Act in exchange for a whole bunch of money. Because the federal government has more powers of taxation than the provincial governments. And so some of those really complicated questions about why are we doing this in these really complicated ways, a lot of that comes from our sort of agreements and the way that we set out residual powers in 1867. So that's my lecture chunk for this particular unit. We will get into sort of early Indigenous history and sort of early Indigenous experiences in Canada next week.